essentially, and the last experiment with a dictator ends. So in 2 out of 3 cases it did turn out benignly, but in the last case it was very traumatic, and this attempt to use dictators to run the government turns into a bad experience and an important learning experience for the Florentine government, and really reinforces the government's commitment to a broader based, semi-popular kind of government. Now we know already that the period of greatest democracy in Florence was the late 14th century. We've had the plague hit by then, the Depression is in full swing. To make things worse, Florence fought a war with the Pope and therefore lost all his banking business, which was a huge blow to the Florentine economy. Unemployment and poverty soar, and this is the period in 1378 when the Ciompi, the lower guilds, rise up, defeat the greater guilds, and seize control of the government. And there is a government by the lesser guilds for a couple of years, which was not all that unusual for late 14th century Europe, but you know, in the history of Florence, it's the only time you see the lower guilds with really any significant political influence. However, it doesn't last long. By 1382, the trend towards a more oligarchical, narrower government resumes. And this happens when the great guilds stage a lockout of the workers in the woolen cloth industry. They can't go to work, they can't earn money, they can't feed their families. As a result of that, the Ciompi regime collapses and the great guilds return to power. And politically speaking, you might see this as really the beginning of the Renaissance period in Florence. In 1382, as the great guilds come back to power, it is the patrician Albizzi family which takes control of the government. And the Albizzi family controls the government from 1382 to 1434 by controlling the electoral process. This is the period, 1382 to 1434 essentially, in which the Renaissance is born in Florence. This is the period of that great crisis with Milan, 1380 to 1402. This is the period when civic humanism is born with Salutati and Bruni and the whole idea of civic education. This is the period that Salutati and Bruni whip up popular and patriotic support for the government by comparing Florence to Rome and saying we can be as great as Rome and we can obtain Roman virtues and be like Rome was. And also this is a period in which Salutati, the chancellor, stresses the fact that the war with Milan, the crisis with Milan, was more than just a kind of power political struggle. It represented a struggle between the Florentine Republic, which was a good form of government, and the cruel and evil dictatorship of Milan, which was a bad form of government. And of course, we know that in Milan, and we'll see this more in the next lecture, the Viscontis were dictators. And Florence did have a form of republic, so this is not too far from the truth. Salutati further argued that the republic in Florence, in fact a republic in general, was the best form of government that you could have. Much better than a dictatorship, because political participation by the citizens allowed individual personal development and allowed the city to be governed more wisely by more different heads and more different efforts than a dictator could. So we see the political ideas of the Renaissance developing here. Now we know Florence survived this crisis with Milan, 1382 to 1400, but by 1425, Florence becomes involved in another war with Milan. And again, we find that Florence does not have the military power to really be successful, and in fact, they lose this war to Milan in 1425. And as a result of that loss, the Albizzi family falls from power, and at this point is when the Medici family takes over and becomes the great Renaissance ruling family of Florence. The Medici rule essentially from 1434 to 1494. The father of his country, he was called, Pater Patriae, the father of this family, the great patriarch, was Cosimo de' Medici, a very wealthy banker. He seized power during the loss to Milan by using his political connections to create a mob riot all through Florence. And then he stepped forward and he said, I've got my personal mercenary army here, led by my personal general, Francesco Sforza, and I'll restore power in Florence, restore law and order in Florence. And in fact, he does step in, restore order, and as a result, he gains control of the government from basically solving a situation he created himself. So, Cosimo, in many ways, you could say, seizes control of the government through a plot. Well, Cosimo rules from behind the scenes from 1434 to 1464. Never holds any office, but has his friends sitting on all the election commissions, strikes off the names he doesn't like, gets all his friends elected, and he's there pulling the strings behind the scenes. And if there's ever any trouble, he's got his personal mercenary army with his personal general, Francesco Sforza, and they're going to be there, to be the muscle if he needs it. In most cases, he doesn't need that kind of muscle. A lot of historians argue that Cosimo ruled as a dictator, but he never changed the structure of the government, and we've seen what that structure was. The republic was kept, it was never done away with. The electoral process was kept. It was manipulated, but it was kept. And so whether he was actually a dictator or not is, I think, kind of open to debate. He didn't rule arbitrarily. In fact, he was a tremendous patron of artists and scholars, of books and learning and painting and so forth, and was a huge factor in promoting the growth of Renaissance culture, art, and learning. Now, some historians like Lauro Martinez will argue that he was this great patron of the arts to legitimize, or even perhaps to cover up the fact that he was ruling as a dictator. But, I still think that's going a little bit too far. I think the Medici, Cosimo, and his family had a sincere interest in Renaissance culture, and they were governing the city not as dictators, but as probably a pretty small oligarchy. In the international realm, Cosimo pursued a policy of peace because he knew peace would be the best thing for the Florentine economy and for Florentine art and culture. In 1447, a power vacuum developed in Milan, as we'll see in the next lecture. At that point, Cosimo uses the opportunity to install his personal general, Francesco Sforza, as the new ruler of Milan. And we'll see how that worked out in the next lecture. Immediately thereafter, Florence and Milan sign a peace treaty. Cosimo goes one step farther in 1454 when he engineers what's known as the Peace of Lodi. The Peace of Lodi was in effect a military alliance of northern Italian cities, the most important of which were Florence, Venice, and Milan. And it was really put in place to offset a southern power bloc which had grown up when the Pope, the papacy, and the Kingdom of Naples had come together in an alliance. So what Cosimo is trying to do is maintain a kind of balance of power between North and South Italy, and this balance of power maintains the peace of Italy, maintains the prosperity of Florence and other cities, and helps Renaissance culture grow and the Renaissance art and learning grow during this period. I should also point out at this point that the whole notion of balance of power was at this point a kind of new concept in diplomacy, and Cosimo should get some credit for kind of thinking in these terms and engineering this new idea of diplomacy. But eventually Cosimo died in 1464 and was followed as ruler by his son Lorenzo de' Medici, also called Lorenzo the Magnificent. It was during Lorenzo's rule that the Renaissance really reached a zenith in Florence. He was a tremendous patron of art, culture, and learning, just like Cosimo had been. Humanism flourishes, art flourishes, there's peace and prosperity in the city. And Lorenzo pretty much continues Cosimo's foreign policy of maintaining peace, a balance of power, for the prosperity of the whole Italian peninsula. And one way he does this, one way Lorenzo does this, is by pioneering the modern diplomatic system. You can read about this in a very famous book by a historian named Garrett Mattingly called Renaissance Diplomacy. But what exactly happens is, for the first time, Lorenzo sends permanent ambassadors from Florence to the other Italian cities, the other Italian powers. But before this, there had been no permanent embassies or ambassadors. If you wanted to send a diplomatic message, you had to send a special envoy to Milan or to Rome or whatever, and he would take the message down and bring the answer back, but there was no permanent presence. Lorenzo now develops a permanent ambassador presence in all the major powers, meaning he's in continuous contact with them, can negotiate with them and ensure the peace, or at least try to ensure the peace. So in many ways, this is the birth of the modern diplomatic system. Other cities do the same thing. They send out their own ambassadors and the system begins to work. Well, things are going very well in Florence up to 1494. And in 1494, the good times end and a series of events start to unfold, which a lot of historians say brought about the end of the Renaissance in Florence. The big blow was that Lorenzo died. He was replaced by his brother Piero de' Medici. Now, whereas Lorenzo was called the Magnificent and Cosimo was called the father of his country, Piero was called the Gouty, because apparently his greatest achievement was having gout in his feet, which is a very painful illness. He was a terrible ruler. And it just, bad luck would have it that during his period in power, which was a very vulnerable period for Florence, Italy underwent a major foreign crisis. And that foreign crisis was caused by the French king, Charles VIII. The French king, Charles VIII, had a claim on the throne of the Kingdom of Naples. This claim came from the fact that Naples and Sicily had been conquered in the early Middle Ages by the Normans, 1054, and had been ruled for a number of years by an Angevin dynasty, a French dynasty. There had been since then other intervening dynasties, a couple of Spanish rulers and others, but Charles still believed that when the king of Naples died, that he had a legitimate claim to the throne of Naples. And so to enforce this claim, he invades Italy. Huge army, much bigger military apparatus than anybody in Italy has. Marches down from the north, conquers Florence easily. Piero runs away, the Medici family is ejected, and in place of the Medici, after Charles marches on and leaves Florence alone, a radical monk by the name of Savonarola takes over. This radical monk Savonarola believes that Florence has lost the war and been conquered because of Renaissance culture, because the Florentines have been sinful. They've had too much luxury, too much culture, too much learning, too much humanism. They've gotten soft, and now we got to get back to obeying God and being strict and religious and all that. And so among his first acts, Savonarola takes huge numbers of Renaissance books out to the city square and burns them, just to demonstrate that, this was wrong and we've got to go back to the straight and narrow path. A lot of historians think that Savonarola's brief reign was the end of the Renaissance in Florence. And this book burning could kind of symbolize that, but it's controversial to maintain that the Renaissance ends at this point. Savonarola himself does in fact end. He doesn't last very long. In 1502, he makes the mistake of claiming that the Pope is a heretic. The Pope then sends forces to the north, which eject Savonarola from power. He is taken down to the city square and burnt at the stake as a heretic. So that was the end of Savonarola. At that point, a republic is restored in Florence, with the chancellor being a man named Piero Soderini, and his right-hand man being a man that I'm sure you've heard of, Niccolo Machiavelli. This republic is a broader government than even the Medici regime was, makes a number of concessions to the lower classes, but is very unpopular with the patricians. Later it falls from power and the patricians bring back the Medici as dukes of Florence in the 16th century.